All right, everybody is in here, I think. So before beginning today's seminar, the Field Museum would like to acknowledge that it resides on the ancestral homelands of the Three Fires Confederacy, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. The area was also a site of trade, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other Native tribes. So today I have the pleasure of introducing our first seminar speaker in honor of Women's History Month, my friend and colleague, Dr. Jingmai O'Connor. I first met Jingmai back in 2015. I had to do some math to figure out what year it was when I was a postdoc at the AMNH, and she was visiting as a seminar speaker. And I even got the opportunity to get to know her a little better with some after seminar drinks, where I had a really good time chatting with her. And little did I know that our paths would lead us to both being curators here at the Field Museum. Jingmai began here as an associate curator of fossil reptiles in 2020, and prior to that, she was a professor at the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, where she also did a postdoc. Jingmai's research program focuses on the dinosaur-bird transition, the evolution of flight, and the biology of stem avians. She's published over 130 papers, including Nature, Science, and PNAS. In 2019, Jingmai was also awarded the Schuchert Award by the Paleontological Society, which honors a paleontologist under the age of 40 who demonstrates excellence and promise. Today, Jingmai is not only going to talk to us about her research, but she's also going to talk to us about her career path, specifically in light of being a woman in science. Come on up.
Thank you, Sarah, for that lovely introduction. And thank you, everyone, for being here this afternoon. So I don't know about you, but I was really inspired by the Black History Month Armor Seminar programming, which had a theme of sustainability, but also of powerful women. So with the blessings of the Women's History Month Programming Committee, I'm going to do a talk that's a little bit different than our typical scientific armor talk. It's going to be part science, and part sustainability and inspirational female story. And I believe that both science and the human story are beginningless journeys without end. Now, it was just over 3 years ago that I gave my job talk, which was a tour de force of all the best research that I had done up until that date. So I was kind of struggling with the topic for the science part of this talk. And then I decided I was going to talk to you about a group of birds called the Enantiornithes, which represent the first major avian radiation, with the second major avian radiation being that of crown birds, the birds that we see alive today. And this is the group that was the focus of my dissertation. And in my case, I didn't have a choice of my dissertation topic. It was just given to me. So I was trying to get myself pumped up about working on this group. And at the time, I didn't really have interest in birds. And so I was kind of like, okay, they're birds, but they have teeth. So I guess that's cool. But I just want to say that after working on this group for over 15 years, I have discovered that these birds are more bizarre than I ever possibly could have imagined. So let's start with some basic enantiornithine facts. They are the dominant group of terrestrial birds, and they have a fossil record that is over 64 million years long. They count for more than half of the Mesozoic avian diversity, but despite these two facts, you've probably never heard of them. Their fossils have been found on every continent with the exception of Antarctica, and they're mostly arboreal. We do see greater ecological diversity by the late Cretaceous, but most of them, especially in the early Cretaceous, appear to have lived in trees. So we can kind of think of them as Cretaceous passerines or songbirds, which are mostly arboreal and account for about 70% of living birds today. Now, the early Cretaceous record of enantiornithines is fantastic. There are thousands of specimens that have been uncovered, most of which are nearly complete, fully articulated, often preserving soft tissue, and most of them come from China, which is why I spent so much time there. So here we're looking at a bunch of specimens that all come from the earliest documented record of enantiornithines, which is the so-called Protopteryx horizon of the Huajiaying Formation. That's about 130 million years old. And all these specimens that you can see here represent different species, and they encompass significant morphological diversity that tells us that this group must have arisen in the fossil record much earlier. We just don't yet have evidence. Now, the late Cretaceous fossil record of enantiornithines isn't great. Like, for example, if you look On the left-hand side of the screen, all those fragmentary coracoids actually represent 4 different genera and more than 6 taxa. Yet still from this fragmentary record, we are able to tell that by the late Cretaceous, Enantiornithines had evolved in parallel to the crown lineage, many characteristics that we associate with modern birds, such as a toothless beak, and the loss of a bone called the postorbital, which would have freed up the skull for cranial kinesis. We also see a similar pattern in the postcranial skeleton. So for example, in early Cretaceous Enantiornithines, they have a structure called the sternal keel that's very small, but in the late Cretaceous, it has a modern looking morphology. So the sternum is the breastbone, and it has this ventrally projecting process that runs along the midline that helps to increase the surface area of the breastbone for the attachment of the pectoralis major muscle, which provides the muscular output for the downward phase of the avian flight stroke, during which lift and thrust are generated. So you can see it projecting here, and we can see it on these 2 fossil birds. So what I'm trying to get at is that, and skeletally speaking, Enantiornithines really weren't that strange. So what I'd like to focus on is their unique developmental strategy and how this developmental strategy has constrained their radiation and may also underpin their eventual extinction. Now, when we talk about developmental strategy, living birds utilize a whole range of strategies across what we call the altricial precocial spectrum. So on the altricial end, you have chicks that are born naked, blind, helpless, completely dependent on their parents. And on the precocial side, you have chicks that hatch with well-developed hind limbs that are capable of independent terrestrial locomotion. They forage for themselves, they thermoregulate for themselves through a dense downy plumage. They're not yet capable of flight, but they rely on their parents pretty much only for protection. Now, there's one group of living birds that represents an outlier on the precocial end of the spectrum, and this is the so-called superprecocial megapodes, also known as brush turkeys, mound builders, or incubator birds. And they get this name because of their unique nesting strategy, in which the eggs are buried under a mound of rotting vegetation. So this is similar to what we see in crocodilians, the other living group of archosaur reptiles, and also what is inferred from most non-avian dinosaurs. So these birds receive no parental care. And by the time they dig themselves free of the mound, which takes about 48 hours and sounds terrifying, they are emerged from this mound capable of flight. So if you look at this little chick here, you can see that it has fully developed flight feathers, but it also has a typical downy body plumage that we associate with precocial chicks. Now, all evidence for Enantiornithines suggests that Enantiornithines were highly precocial and also capable of flight from within 24 hours of emerging from the egg. So this hypothesis first came about based on some embryos that were found in the 1980s in Mongolia that showed a very high degree of ossification. So if you look at a precocial chick, it will have a more highly ossified skeleton than in an altricial chick at the time of hatching. And then this hypothesis was subsequently supported by the discovery of juvenile Enantiornithines from China that appeared to have their flight feathers already in place. And then later by this embryo that you can see here that has these strange structures poking out that are interpreted as the flight feathers, so that this bird, when it emerged from the egg, would have been capable of flight. Now, what's unusual about Enantiornithines is that birds that are precocial typically are on the larger side of the avian body size spectrum, whereas Enantiornithines are typically much smaller. Yes, by the late Cretaceous, we do see a greater diversity in body sizes, but most Enantiornithines are very small. And to give you an idea of just how small some of them could get, this is a piece of undescribed Burmese amber, so it comes from Myanmar. It's about 100 million years old. And this is a specimen that is in private hands, and I've seen pictures of it crop up in many different labs, but I guess the private owners want too much money for it, so it remains unknown to science, but I'm going to share it with you anyways. So here we have fingers for scale, not my fingers, but we're looking at basically an entire bird trapped in this tiny piece of amber. So this is the skull, this is probably the right wing and the left wing and the abdomen and the hind limbs down here. in this very, very tiny piece of amber. So this bird is probably smaller than a hummingbird, but we can see that the flight feathers are preserved. So this is a fledged bird that is capable of flight. Now, the idea that enantiornithines had precocial flight was something that was based entirely on the degree of ossification of the skeleton and soft tissue preservation, but it had never really been tested quantitatively to see if the proportions of the skeleton actually differ through ontogeny compared to birds that do not have precocial flight. So this is something that my postdoc Matteo and I started working on. And this is preliminary data because it turned out to be a lot harder than we thought to find ontogenetic series of living birds. But we can, if you look at these preliminary results, you can already see that enantiornithines have a trajectory, a growth trajectory that is distinct from what we see in living birds, supporting the idea that these birds had precocial flight. So how does this super precocial development, or highly precocial development, affect their skeleton, affect their morphology? So for example, let's go back to that breastbone, the sternum, for which on which the flight muscles attach. So in non-avian dinosaurs, there are two sternal plates that are bilaterally symmetrical. And in birds and other flying dinosaurs, they fuse along the midline into a single element that we call the sternum. But we know from these fossils of early birds that they only fuse and become a single element very late in ontogeny, basically when the bird is approaching adulthood. And we also see from fossils of birds that are a little bit more primitive than enantiornithines that a keel can only start to form after the sternum has fused into a single structure. And this is because the keel projects off of the midline where this fusion is occurring. But what we see in most enantiornithines is a different pattern. In fact, most of the sternum ossifies from a single center that's located on the midline of the body. So here we're looking at a juvenile enantiornithine. It's the same specimen, just photos taken under very different light conditions. And you can see here this, this main ossification center that's located on the midline of the body. And we can see that in this very young juvenile, the keel is already starting to form, projecting ventrally off of this midline ossification center. So looking at all these different, or looking at many different juvenile enantiornithines, we were able to piece together the unique ossification sequence of the sternum in this group, which we believe evolved in response to precocial flight in order to allow the sternal keel, this very important flight-related feature that increases the surface area of the sternum for the flight muscles, to allow this feature to form much earlier in ontogeny than in species that had this more primitive plesiomorphic ossification sequence. Now, as much as their precocial development has has led to unique morphologies in enantiornithines, I hypothesize that their precocial development has also limited the morphological diversity of this group. So here we're looking at two different species of enantiornithines that we described from this 100-million-year-old Burmese amber. And on the right, you can see the specimen that we named Enantiorniths that has this hyper elongate third pedal digit, and which is a morphology that we do not see in any of the 10,000 species of living birds. And the specimen that we named Fortipezzavis, which is the one I would like to focus on here, it's probably a little bit more difficult to figure out what's going on in this piece of amber. Here, there's actually no bone preserved. There's only soft tissue. So only skin, the skin of the foot is preserved. But if you look closely, you can see one of the pedal ungles, one of the claws of the toes preserved here. It's a little bit easier to make sense of if you look at the CT data. So what we're looking at is, again, a morphology of the foot that we don't have present in any of the known living birds, in which the outer toe, so the fourth toe, is twice as wide as the other toes. And so we hypothesize that this is an adaptation for utilizing mobile perches. So it is an adaptation of the foot that increases stability when using this type of perch. So by increasing the surface area of the foot, in the lateral portion of the foot, you're increasing the stability through contact friction. But also, if you think about it, how if you widen your stance, you're more stable. So this is why it's increasing the contact area in the foot in the outer lateral portion. So in living birds that utilize these unstable mobile perches, such as alcidinids like bee eaters and kingfishers, they have this unique morphology called syndactyly, in which the outer two digits become essentially one functional digit encased in soft tissue. And you can see how this morphology gracefully increases the surface area of the lateral portion of the foot to help them cope with these unstable perches that they utilize. Now, all the bizarre or specialized foot morphologies that we see in living birds, such as syndactyly or heterodactyly or zygodactyly, are all present only in altricial birds. So we hypothesize that the precocial development of enantiornithines may have precluded them from evolving in parallel some of the similar morphologies that we see in living birds and forced them to adapt to specialized ecological niches through unique morphologies that we don't see in any living bird today. Now, another strange thing about enantiornithines, and this is something that they inherited from dinosaurs, is that they reach sexual reproductive maturity before they reach skeletal maturity. So modern birds are very specialized. They have this rapid growth in which almost all birds reach adult size within the first year of growth. And most of them grow very quickly and reach adult size in just a matter of weeks. But enantiornithines grew very slowly and became reproductively active before they reached skeletal maturity. So we know this by looking at this one particular specimen. This is a cross-section of a femur of an enantiornithine. And on the outside, you can see the cortical bone. And on the inside, you see this weird looking tissue. This is called medullary bone. It's a type of bone tissue that's only present in birds. And it basically represents a calcium reservoir for the formation of eggshell. So it's only present in birds right before they lay eggs. And so if we look more closely at the bone here, we know by looking at the specimen that this is a reproductively active individual that died when it was laying eggs. Now, if we look at the cortical bone, we can see that there's a line of arrested growth, which tells us that this animal was at least 1 year old. But if you look at the bone on the other side of the line of arrested growth, we see no signs that growth is slowing down or ceasing. So this tells us that this is an actively growing individual that is reproductively active. Now, one thing about living birds is not only do they reach reproductive maturity after they reach skeletal maturity, but they do not have their sexual ornamentation or sexually dimorphic plumage until they become reproductively active. But enantiornithines, again, are very weird, and it appears that their sexually dimorphic ornamental feathers appeared in the first post-hatching molt, the juvenile molt. So here we're looking at a juvenile enantiornithine. It has these beautiful ornamental tail feathers, which we hypothesize are sexually dimorphic. And we know this specimen is a juvenile because if we look closely at the sternum, we can see that the 4 sternal ossification centers have yet to coalesce into a single sternum. And this is something that we know occurs very early during the development, the post-hatching development of these chicks, definitely within the first year of life. So this is a very young individual that has sexual ornaments already present. Now, these sexual ornaments are also more bizarre than I ever could have imagined. So they were originally only known from specimens preserved in rock, not only from China, there was also one specimen found from Brazil, but because they're preserved in rock and all we really have are the melanosomes within the feathers, we don't actually know anything about the 3-dimensional morphology. So I was, in the process of modeling how I thought these feathers might look so that we could do some aerodynamic analyses with a team of engineers at Tsinghua University when my colleague approached me with some of these feathers preserved in amber. So sorry, I skipped one thing I wanted to mention. So these feathers are very unusual. And if you look at them, you can see that the rachis is proportionately very wide. And it has this weird kind of medial dark line that runs the length of the feather. And because of this proportionately wide looking morphology, these tail feathers got the name rachis dominated feathers. So when we actually were able to see what the three-dimensional morphology of these feathers were, I have to say my mind was a little bit blown. We had always assumed that these feathers were just modified pennaceous feathers, meaning that they would have had a hollow tube-like structure that was probably filled with medullary pith. But what we actually found was that the feathers are not hollow tubes. They actually form an open C-shaped cross-section, and the keratin forming this rachis is extremely thin. At this point in the rachis, it's about 3 to 10 microns thick, and only in this medial dark line, which we think is the rachial ridge, and where the barbs are attaching at the edges of the feather, do we reach thicknesses of about 40 to 50 microns. So this is a very bizarre, now extinct feather morphology. This is a specimen that I've been working on recently. It's a manuscript that I have reviewed that I'm hoping to hear back from any day. But we're again looking at a small piece of amber, very small, fingers for scale, not my fingers. And here you can see a flight feather, probably it's a primary feather, and a cluster of body feathers. It includes some cool insects. There's a tick inside. But if we flip the feathers over and look at the underside of this cluster of feathers, we see a strange morphology. And what we're actually looking at are immature feathers that were actively growing at the time that they were encased in amber. So this tube-like structure that we're looking at is the keratinous sheath that protects the developing part of the feather. And the tip of the feather forms first. So that tip of the feather has already burst out of the keratinous sheath, which is the feathers that we can see here. Now, what's interesting about this is that all the feathers appear to be at approximately the same stage of development, which indicates a rapid or simultaneous molt. Now, this in itself is not unusual because we do see rapid or simultaneous molts in living birds, but only in very young birds. Adult birds, which have many energetic demands, will molt much more slowly in order to conserve energy. But juvenile birds, which need to molt quickly in order to keep up with their growing mass, will molt their feathers much more quickly. So altricial chicks have what is essentially a simultaneous molt, whereas precocial chicks, which have other competing energetic demands, will have a rapid molt that is not quite simultaneous. So I looked back at some other juvenile enantiornithines that I had looked at, that I had described previously because they preserved immature feathers. So here we're looking at these immature feathers preserved. These weird strap-like morphology is again because the feather is encased inside its keratinous sheath, and it hasn't unfurled into the typical feather morphology that we are used to. Now, if you look at these specimens, we see that these immature body feathers are all over the body. So this is confirming that these birds had these simultaneous molts, despite the fact that they were super precocial and investing energy. Sorry, don't know what that was. Investing energy in their independent locomotion, which is flight, which is the most physically demanding form of locomotion. Now, those megapodes that I mentioned earlier that are super precocial are able to conserve energy by having the most protracted juvenile molt of any bird. Oh, okay, sorry. That's what happened. Oh. So the last specimen I'm going to show you before I try to tie all this information together is this hatchling enantiornithine that is preserved again in this Burmese amber. So it's almost a complete specimen. You can see the head here and the neck. Here's one wing. You can see that it's fledged. All the flight feathers are present. Here we can see the tail and one of the feet. And just a close-up of the foot, just to give you an appreciation of just how pristinely preserved these specimens are. I mean, it looks like it could just be a living bird, right? So this specimen we just described a few years back, and I hadn't really thought about how weird its plumage was until I started thinking about simultaneous molts in enantiornithines. So what we're looking at in this bird is a hatchling enantiornithine that is combining super superprecocial characteristics of the plumage with altricial characteristics. So superprecocial in that it's fully fledged, the flight feathers are present, but altricial in that the body plumage is extremely sparse. So altricial chicks have very sparse body plumage because having plumage would actually impede the heat transfer from the adult to the juvenile. So because they're relying on their parents to thermoregulate, they have this sparse body plumage. But precocial chicks, which thermoregulate on their own, have this dense downy plumage in order to help them reduce the thermostatic costs of being warm-blooded or possibly hot-blooded, because insulation helps to keep the body heat close to the body, so thus reducing the cost of regulating temperature. So let's put all this data together, and we're able to kind of recreate the hypothetical enantiornithine molt sequence present in juveniles. So we see that juveniles hatch with this very sparse body plumage, which is again energetically costly because they don't have insulation. And then they have simultaneous molts, which is energetically costly because of the high cost of keratin synthesis of producing all these feathers. And then the juveniles have sexual ornamentation already present, which is also, again, energetically costly, not just because of the keratin synthesis of producing these large ornamental feathers, but also because of the possible detrimental effects to flight of having these tails in your wake. So what we see with enantiornithines is that they had enormous competing energetic demands very early during their ontogeny. So they're babies and they need to grow. That requires energy. Of course, they grew slowly and took many years to reach adult size. They also have the energetic investment of thermoregulation, which would have been temporarily elevated during hatching when they had the sparse body plumage, but also during the simultaneous molt. They also have to invest energy into producing their feathers when they go through their molts. And they also have to invest energy to forage. And studies on living birds, ornithological studies tell us that inexperienced young juvenile birds require more time foraging to reach the caloric demands of their existence. And also enantiornithines had precocial flight, which is the most costly form of vertebrate locomotion. Why this is important is because animals that have very high energetic demands are more susceptible to extinction. And so I hypothesize that this was a major factor in the eventual extinction of this clade. And I don't think that we can point to any one factor as the sole cause for this end Cretaceous extinction selectivity. I think it was several different factors working together, but I think that the high energetic demands was probably a major factor, especially if you think about the fact that the end Cretaceous mass extinction was an asteroid-induced impact winter, which would have then decreased global temperatures, meaning that the thermostatic costs would have been elevated. So this really would have been exacerbated during periods when they were hatching, when they had very little insulation. In addition, being highly precocial is just associated with high mortality rates anyways. So for example, I read this paper about these megapodes, and it looked at two different populations during the first 3 weeks of their life, and it showed that they had between 88 and 100% mortality rates, mostly because of cats. So if we want to protect these indigenous faunas in places like Australia, I'm sorry, but cats gotta go. And there's a couple other things that I didn't really have time to talk about. For example, it seems that their digestive system lacked the phenotypic flexibility that we see in living birds, which may have made them unable to feed on things like detritus, like seeds that were probably the only food source available during this impact winter, and also possible reproductive limitations. They seem to utilize only immobile ground nests, and that also may have been an important factor. So stay tuned. I don't plan to go anywhere. So hopefully in another 10 years, I can give you another talk about, updated talk about how strange enantiornithines are. But now I'd like to talk about how I got here with my dream job as a museum curator, being given this wonderful opportunity to inspire people and make a difference. And sure, as every academic in this room knows, we've all worked really hard. But how much of who I am is thanks to the struggles of the women and men who came before me? Epigenetics is a science of how the experiences of previous generations can affect who we are. It demonstrates that environmental influences like what our parents and grandparents ate, what chemicals they were exposed to, what stresses they experienced, are all factors that affect how our bodies look and work. This means that the life we are living now has a direct impact on our future descendants. This means that the past and the future are now. This means that my grandmother's story is also my story. So in honor of Women's History Month, I would like to tell you the story of my mother and her mother and her mother's mother, and share with you how me being here, talking to you today, is an extension of their story, and in large part possible because of their experiences. So this is my grandmother pictured here. Her name is Yongming, which translates to eternal light, which I love. That sounds so cool. My name translates to crystal plum blossom, not nearly as cool. So my grandparents come from near the city of Weihai, close to the tip of the Shandong Peninsula. And they were born during the end days of the feudal system following the collapse of the Qing dynasty. They were born to wealthy families that were part of that dying system. My grandmother was born to a family of wealthy landowners where foot binding was still practiced. So my great-grandmother had bound feet, and as a result was in constant pain, and she was bedridden. So my grandmother would tell my mother stories about how she learned to make dumplings from her mother's bedroom. The servants would bring the dough and the filling, and they would make the dumplings in her bed. And at this stage in my grandmother's sheltered life, she had never seen a kitchen. So she actually had no idea how you went from a raw dumpling to something that was edible. I just want you guys to know that the dumpling tradition in our family is going strong. My maternal grandfather, so my grandmother's father, was considered himself a modern man. He dressed like a Westerner, and even though he was very wealthy, he worked for a living. He spoke English and he worked as a translator. Now he had arranged for my grandmother to marry into a family of high-ranking scholars, which required wives with foot binding, with bound feet. So my grandmother's feet were bound. But as part of his progressive thinking, my grandfather later changed his mind, our great-grandfather, decided that it was barbaric, and he had my grandmother's feet unbound 2 years later, but the damage was already done. 8 of her toes had been broken, and walking would be painful for the rest of her life. Now, in wealthy families, there was the unfortunate practice that for every child, they would purchase a slave, kidnapped from some other family, who would spend their life as the companions to that child. And so in this picture, this barefoot girl is the slave to the girl in the middle with the bound feet. So my grandmother, as an extension of the progressive thinking of her father, set her slave free. So in the final days of the Qing dynasty, reforms permitted female education, and my great-grandfather, as a modern man, sent my grandmother to boarding school as one of the early generations of females in China to receive a formal education. And my grandmother would tell my mother about how proud she felt to put on her Girl Scout uniform and go to school. Unfortunately, her education was cut short by the death of her mother, and soon she was forced to honor her arranged marriage to my grandfather, Zidong, or Purple East. So as much as my maternal great-grandfather considered himself modern, my paternal great-grandfather was lost in the past. The imperial examination system for scholars ended in 1905, and robbed of his one vocation, he became one of the millions of victims of the Opium War. And even though my grandfather was born after the end of the Qing dynasty, his father made him wear a queue, which he cut off as soon as his father died, and he left his home to become a teacher. With the collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1911, many factions were fighting for power. All the while, the country was being divided by foreign powers. So continuing the reforms of the dying Qing dynasty rose the new culture movement, which pushed for a new anti-feudal culture. And nationwide protests erupted on May 4th, 1919, when educated new youths gathered in Tiananmen to protest the weak response of the Chinese government to the Treaty of Versailles that allowed Japan to retain territories in Shandong. This brought the working class into the new culture movement. Incensed by the rape of Nanjing in 1937, although part of the dying feudal system, my grandparents were inspired by this vision of a new world. And so they left everything behind and they joined a group of guerrilla fighters to resist the Japanese. Although called Kangre, which means resist Japan, they essentially represented part of the Communist Party. And everywhere they marched, they taught people to read, they spoke about a class-free society and gender equality. My grandfather, as a teacher, was sent to colleges to promote communist ideology, and everyone was encouraged to speak their mind. What they did not actually do was fight the Japanese, and my grandfather spoke out against this, and that was not well received by the Communist Party. Meanwhile, my grandmother had become an important official in the Communist Party, but at the same time was becoming disillusioned by the disparity between ideology and reality. Equality meant that women were literally treated the same as men, expected to carry the same heavy weapons on these long marches, even though many women had crippled once bound feet. And with no specialized medical care, women were dying in disproportionately higher numbers, especially due to things like childbirth. So when an execution order for my grandfather passed her desk, she warned him. And when he asked her to flee, she fled. I don't have time to tell you the rest of the story, but my grandparents are still listed as official traitors to the Communist Party. So my mom was born in Hong Kong, where her parents were refugees, living in enormous hardship and poverty. And this ruin that you can see behind my mom is where she grew up, in a small island called Remy's Mill. And these pictures of my aunt and my mother are refugee ID camp photos, where they would get food from the so-called rice bowl Christians, missionaries who took advantage of the refugee suffering, offering the choice between conversion, offering the choice between faith or starvation. Eventually, my mother met an American who was a scholar of Chinese anthropology. They married. Eventually, they moved to the US, and my mom, for a while, was a very successful businesswoman. But with the birth of her first child, she decided to become a stay-at-home mother. She eventually remarried an artist, had 3 kids, including myself. But we struggled financially, so my mother decided to go back to school. And I was about 10 years old at this time. So with 4 ill-behaved children, she studied relentlessly for the GRE, and she got a nearly perfect score, and she was awarded a prestigious scholarship. So from an initial, more practical choice to become a social worker, she decided to follow her passion and study geology. She was about the same age I am now, and she can still do the splits. So during her PhD, because we didn't have money for a babysitter, she would take us with her into the field and also into the laboratory, where she would literally give us cups of liquid nitrogen to go play with and keep ourselves busy. And 3.5 years later, she had earned her PhD. So it is from my mom that I was introduced to geology, and I learned to work my butt off, but to also follow my passion so that it hardly feels like work at all. Now, all the academics in this room know that the first few years following your PhD are of extreme uncertainty as you bounce from postdoc to postdoc trying to land a permanent position. And since my mom had to support the family, she could not do this. So she got a more stable position as a community college teacher. And it was here that she found her new passion in teaching environmental science. But she feels it is not enough to teach people about environmental issues created by human activity, but we must address the underlying causes, the relationship we are taught to have with ourselves through consumerism, the cognitive dissonance that allows this to happen, and the true nature of our quantum reality through which we can truly access our consciousness. And thus began the current chapter in my mother's life, the search for enlightenment. Now, I do not aspire to such lofty goals. I have set the much more realistic goal of self-realization for myself, but this is not a religious journey. Rather, my mother recognizes that in order to heal the world, we must first heal ourselves. And I thought it was really powerful when Cheryl Johnson was speaking, and she said, everything my mother did, she did out of love. And the problem with the world now is that people don't love anymore. So I think Hazel Johnson and my mother would both agree that what we need to do is learn how to love, and that it begins with ourselves. And just as previously, my mom pushed me to pursue science and value education, she has pushed her children to join her on this spiritual journey. And this journey has helped me enormously to deal with my anxiety that has troubled me most of my life, and also my depression from the inequity and corruption and environmental degradation that we see rampant in our society and the world. And as part of this journey, my mom has opened her heart and her home to her community college students, many of which come from broken, troubled homes, and most of which come from underrepresented backgrounds. And so she has taken her students on soul-searching adventures in the US and China, many of which that I've been grateful to be a part of. So anyone who has chatted with me knows that I try to live my family's legacy, the search for a better future that I can trace back to my great-grandparents. But how do we get there? We need diversity, not just in science, but at every level of our society. And equity is not just a moral imperative, but we need the creativity and innovation that it brings, because it has been demonstrated that groups of people that are diverse in gender, race, and age perform better and make better decisions, which is going to help us with this environmental crisis. But we must be aware of we must remember the lessons of epigenetics, that many groups of people, if not most people, carry wounds that are many generations deep. And it is only if we acknowledge that can we really serve as mentors and allies. Now, I believe the way that we can achieve this better future is through self-realization, which is the fulfillment of oneself, of the possibilities of one's character and personality. So it is essentially, self-realization is the science of knowing oneself. And self-realization is about finding inner happiness, a happiness that is not contingent on anything external. So it is essentially the antithesis of consumer culture, which is again, the major driver of this mass extinction. But to achieve sustainability really begins and ends with the individual and the consumer choices that we make. And we need to stop replacing one problem with a new problem. So for example, replacing fossil fuels with fuels that are dependent on things like rare elements, or replacing single-use plastics with bioplastics that are associated with a whole array of other issues. What we really need to do is reduce consumption. And in order to do this, I think we need to be able to accept a little bit less comfort. But I invite you to try it. I suggest that you might feel more alive than you have ever felt before. When I go to my parents' house and I'm schlepping buckets of rainwater or dishwater or water that we capture from the washing machine to water all the plants in our garden, I love it. Like I feel so alive. So try it. And no matter how much you already think that you're doing what you can for the environment, we can always do better. And I'm saying this to myself as well. So as much as I'm asked in my role as a curator to inspire the next generation of scientists, I think it is more important to inspire a generation of self-realized individuals. Because what is a scientist? Is it someone in a white lab coat? Is it an exclusive label? Or is it someone who seeks knowledge? So I invite everyone to live their life as a scientist, seeking knowledge about how we can be better people, kinder to ourselves, because if we love ourselves, we're able to love others. Kinder to each other, because we can only create a diverse and equitable society if we act out of compassion for the known and unknown struggles or battles that everyone is struggling with, and better stewards of this planet in light of the mass extinction that we are causing. So whether your job title ends up being scientist or not, if you ask how and why, you are a scientist doing a lifelong PhD on your own existence. So thank you very much for hearing me out and giving me this opportunity to share.
There we go. Sorry about technical difficulties. Jingmai, I just want to say that was really inspiring and beautiful before I open it up to questions. I have a microphone and Matt has one too. So if anybody has any questions, we'd be happy to pass it around.
I know you are a science writer and scientist, and have you considered writing your own story as a memoir? It's an incredible
Yeah.
story.
So thank you. Actually, I have been talking with my mom about turning our family story into a children's book.
That was beautiful, Jingmai.
Thank you.
You say something about cold-blooded or warm-blooded birds. Is that right? Do you? Is it basically we just don't know?
Well, I said warm-blooded or hot-blooded. So, but because these early birds, you know, they're so strange. And if you look at things like their bone tissue, it's definitely possible that they may not have had the hot-blooded, you know, extreme physiology that we see in living birds. So it's something that I've been really eager to investigate with our own resident genius, Yasmina Viman, but she's so busy, as you all know. So one day, eventually, I hope we'll be able to find time for it.
Great. And when is your mom coming to the museum?
Yeah. Well, she, as part of her like being an environmentalist, refuses to get on a plane. So she has looked into the 2-day, 3 trains, different train ride, you know, version of getting over here. So she might come for the Changing Faces of Science exhibit when it opens.
Was there a question? Kate?
Hi, it was a really great talk.
Thank you.
So one thing that I've heard people say is that science is a meritocracy, that, you know, science is colorblind and gender blind and is only about hiring the best person for the job who's doing the best science. And, you know, clearly there are issues with this. And I was wondering, you know, what you would say to that, given the points you raised in your talk.
I think that a lot of us have many biases that we're not aware of. So when we claim that we are seeing things without bias, we're probably just not aware of the biases that are ingrained in us. But also, I think it's important, like the difference between equity and equality, right? Like equality was what the communists were trying to do, doesn't work. That's why we now have a different goal of equity, right? So, I mean, I think that's also something we're going to have to look into with science, because science demands you give up your life to be like to have the productivity necessary to be really successful. So one of the reasons I'm here now and so productive compared to some other females is that I didn't have children. And now I put it off so long, I maybe can't have children. And so, I mean, this shouldn't have to be a choice that people make, but you know, in reality, I think it is a major factor in how productive somebody can be and then how good they look when they're applying for jobs. So I don't really have the solution for how we try to create a more equitable system of comparing males and females in academia, but I think it's something that we should consider.
Thank you for your words. It was an incredible presentation. My father, who I was having a conversation with him the other day, and he was like, "Well, birds are mammals, right?" And I was like, "Oh no, oh God." We talked for a while, and he asked me at the end. He was like, "I don't really understand why paleontology is important to study." And I, of course, had my own answer to that, but it got me thinking as well. And I was curious if you had an answer to that question.
Yeah, I mean, so, 10 years ago, if you asked this question, I'd be like, oh, gateway science, but now that we recognize the Anthropocene mass extinction, that we are in the 6th mass extinction, I think that we can look at the selectivity of past mass extinctions to understand why certain groups went extinct and others didn't, in order to assess vulnerability in animals today, so that we could perhaps, that could better guide our conservation efforts. But none of that is going to matter unless we stop consumption. Because even as much as now we're using sustainable energies, our use of fossil fuels is ever increasing. It has not gone down in response to the fact that we now additionally use sustainable energy sources. So if we don't stop this, like any of the information that we gain, I don't think it's really going to help.
Someone in the chat who would like to ask a question.
Okay, we have one from Jacob Drucker online here. He says, super exciting to get a sense of the enantiornithine molt sequences. Can you talk about how generalizable these results are across all enantiornithines, given the morphological and presumably life history traits across this huge clade?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a really good question because as paleontologists, we do have this tendency to take all the available information and kind of which is for this whole diverse group and try to condense it into one evolutionary story because the bits of evidence come from all different parts. So, and we don't have all the evidence from one particular lineage in one particular place. So, you know, it is hard, like we're basically not able to really say if this molt sequence was present in all enantiornithines, but we find it in early Cretaceous enantiornithines that are 128 million years old. And then we also find evidence for it in mid-Cretaceous enantiornithines from a totally different part of the planet that are, you know, that are about 100 million years old. And yeah, by the late Cretaceous, it does seem that there may have been things like body size may suggest that we would have had some different developmental strategies. If we look at histology, we're certainly seeing some different growth patterns, but still all the evidence from the early to the late Cretaceous points to highly precocial development. So yeah, sorry, I'm kind of like, that's not a good answer to that question. But yeah, the answer to the question is we don't know how ubiquitous these rapid molts would have been, but we do see it for at least 30 million years in Asia. So it definitely was something that persisted for at least half of their fossil record.
All right, we have one from Aaron Steele. Says, thank you for sharing Aaron says, thank you for sharing your story. That was a very powerful experience. I'm curious about the difference between the late Cretaceous and early Cretaceous fossil record of the group. Was their ecology responsible for that decline?
So the disparity in the fossil record basically just has to do with the deposits that we have that yield fossils. So in the early Cretaceous, we have a bunch of Lagerstätten, so these deposits that are yielding tons of specimens. And basically, even though we have thousands of specimens from the early Cretaceous, they almost all record just 10 million years in one area of northeastern China. So and so that's like almost everything we know from enantiornithines comes from these deposits. And then we have like one little blip in the mid Cretaceous, these amber specimens. And then the late Cretaceous record, we have fragments, but they come from all over the world. But we have like maybe just a few even partial skeletons, not a single complete skeleton, and pretty much none of them preserve soft tissues. So it's really difficult to kind of understand the broader evolutionary story of enantiornithines because the data that you have from the early Cretaceous and the late Cretaceous is not really comparable. And also, you know, we have so little data in the late Cretaceous. So that's, yeah, one of the reasons that I'm out there in the summer trying to find more specimens from the late Cretaceous in particular.
We have a question here that I'm gonna.
Thank you. Hello, that was really wonderful. Very reviving in my eyes. As for the museum, I was just curious if you know if they have any programs or if they're putting any money towards like urban gardening or, you know, because the city has a lot of open space to try to make a resolution for the environment. I was just wondering if you had any input as to if the museum is going towards that.
I mean, we have our own edible treasures garden, which I think, you know, with guests can go through and they can see what we're doing and they can learn from it and hopefully be inspired to see what they could do in their own garden or in lots, you know, available to them. But as far as I know, the Field Museum doesn't have any active programs of their own. But Naomi Davis, who runs Blacks and Greens, who gave that really inspiring keynote talk exactly a month ago, I know that she does a lot of urban gardening projects. And I know that a lot of us, after seeing her talk, were really inspired to get involved and participate. So hopefully, you know, come planting season this year, we'll be able to boast that we are involved in more programs around the city.
Yeah, because I feel like, man, like life-changing topic and conversation today. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
We have one more online here if you have time,
Ooh.
from Nasib. How would you suggest we emphasize the importance of paleontology in world regions that place little or no emphasis on the field?
Well, I guess I would really say that we should focus on our own issues, rather than being a country with plenty of issues of its own and focusing on some other part of the world and trying to tell them what to do. I mean, I don't feel like we have the right to do that if we're not doing it right ourselves. I mean, there's issues in America with like fossils can be sold commercially, and this does create some friction. And so, I don't see why we would go, telling other people their business. In general, I think, I think we have to first deal with our own more local problems before we extend our reach outwards and try to influence others. Because I don't know about you, but if somebody who's messing up is telling you like how to fix your stuff, you'd be like, excuse me, like, look at yourself. So that would be, sorry, that's probably not the answer this person wanted, but that would be my advice. Because honestly, like, you can't change other people. You can only change yourself.
Is there another in the chat?
One last
All right, one last one, and then we're gonna let Jingmai go.
It's not one yet. I don't mind.
Okay, this one says, what is your favorite enantiornithine and why?
Ooh, well, yeah, I guess I like this group called the Pungornithidae, just because they're very bizarre. They're very, they have a bunch of morphologies that you don't see in any other clade. They have like very strange teeth. So I've always found them a little bit fascinating, but I have this giant tattoo of an enantiornithine bird that I say is Enantiornithes, which is the only enantiornithine that's known from the African continent. It's very fragmentary. It doesn't preserve feathers, but because I did my tattoo as like a Chinese phoenix, but then just like added claws and teeth to it, I just say it's Enantiornithes because the name kind of fits. So I guess I would also have to say that one is pretty cool.
All right, so let's thank Jingmai again for telling us about both her research and such an inspiring personal story.
Thank you very much.
Come to the other one.
Come to all armor talks, please.
And yeah, all the rest.